Hey, today we're going to look at a story that I like all the Bible. There are parts of the Bible that just resonate with me more than others. Today we're going to look at a story that I really love. It's a story that resonates with me in a significant way. At some point, I'm going to take this series I'm going to take this what we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to build a whole series out of it. What that means is that we've got to cover some ground. So I'm going to jump into it fairly quickly today. The story we're going to look at is a story called the Parable of the Sower. And this is an oddly named story. Almost every English translation that I looked at, and I looked at like 20 or 25, has some version of the parable of the sower or the parable of the farmer or something like that. But it's an odd name for the parable because, as you'll find out by the end, the parable has nothing to do with the sower or with the farmer in the story. We find this parable in Matthew chapter 13. And in verses 1 and 2 of Matthew 13, we find out that Jesus, he's sitting out by a lake, and there gets to be such a huge crowd of people that Jesus gets in a boat and he goes out into the lake to begin teaching this huge crowd of people. So it's a giant crowd of people all there to hear what Jesus has to say. And we're going to pick up right there in Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 3. It says, then he being Jesus, he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. We're going to pause quickly. Dave, will you do me a favor? That back screen is not what I need it to be at all. I've got nothing back there. So would you do me a favor and try to get that up there for me, please? Thank you. We're going to pause for just a second. Jesus told them many things in parables. Probably most of us are familiar with what a parable is. If you're not, it's not a word that we use a lot in modern English, but a parable is just a story that teaches a truth. And so the best example that I could come up with that would be like a modern day parable would be like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, right? So The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a fictional story. It's not a story that came from any specific historical event that happened, but it's a fictional story that teaches an important truth about lying, right? This is kind of a modern day parable. Now, Jesus' primary mode of teaching was in parables. He would tell these stories, these fictional made up stories, but they were stories that were full of truth that people would understand because they may not have been in that exact situation, but they could understand how it applied to life. So Jesus told them things in parables. Now, as we jump back into the story, I want you for a moment, because it's critical with parables that we try to at least put ourselves somewhat in the midst of the story. So if you're an imaginative person, this is probably pretty easy. If you're not, it might be a little bit more challenging, but I want you to try to imagine and picture the scene in your mind. Jesus says, he starts out, there's a farmer who went out to sow his seed. Now, as the farmer goes out to sow his seed, it's important to note, as we move on in the story in a moment, it's important to note this wouldn't be farming like the way you and I might think of farming now. This wouldn't have been let's dig out dig out rows and then like very kind of precisely plant seed. This would have been what's known as broadcast sowing. Okay, so a farmer would have gone out into a field and they would have had a big pouch or basket of seed. Grain seed, some kind of small seed. And they would have grabbed handfuls of the seed and then just thrown the seed. This is called broadcast sowing. The idea of broadcast sowing is that you're trying to get as much seed as you can in as tight of an area as you can and minimize the ability for other birds and things to get the seed. And you're also just speeding up the process. So again, get it in your mind. There's a farmer out in a field. He's broadcast sowing seed. And now as Jesus continues the story, he's going to talk about 4 different places where the seed lands. Those 4 locations are really significant. They hold the key to understanding what's happening in this parable, and they're where we are going to focus pretty much all of our time moving forward. So, jump back into verse 4. As he, the farmer, as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. That's our first location. And the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places. There's our second location. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. Other seed, and here comes our third location, other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. And our fourth location, still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. So you have 4 locations. Now again, keep in mind in the image that you have, we got a farmer broadcast sowing seed. Well, when you're broadcast sowing seed, when you get near the edges of your fields, as you might imagine, you might take a handful of seed and throw it. And if there's a gust of wind at that particular moment, or if you just aren't that great at sowing the seed is not all going to go exactly where you might want it. There's going to be a gust of wind that comes and blows the seed. And so where it might be like, well, why didn't the farmer why wasn't he a little better at planting the seed where he wanted? Because he was broadcast sowing, there would have been some seed that went on paths. There would have been some seed that went in rocky places. There would have been some seed that went in thorny places. And then there would have been, most of it would have gone into the good soil. 4 locations: the path, the rocks, the thorns, and the good soil. Now, as Jesus finishes the teaching, he says something that I love to put myself in these stories and go like, how would I have responded? Jesus says to finish the parable, whoever has ears, let them hear. Now, if I'm standing there, I've got the benefit of seeing what happens after this, right? But if that's all that he said, I'm like, what's that about? I don't even know what that means. Like, yeah, of course some of the seed went other places. What's that have to do with anything? Jesus did this all the time. He taught in these parables. He taught in these fictional stories designed to teach a truth. In a moment, what you're going to see is Jesus explains the parable in a way that he could have just done to start with. And the disciples pick up on this. And they go to Jesus and they're like, hey, why do you do that? And Jesus kind of quotes some Old Testament scripture, but essentially what Jesus says to them is, I do that so that people will have to try. I do that so people will have to put in some effort. I do that so people will have to do something. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but that's essentially what Jesus said. As the story continues, we aren't looking at this part of it, but the disciples say, Jesus, why do you do this? People don't understand it. Why do you do it like this? We don't even understand it. And Jesus says, I do it so that people will have to put some skin in the game. And that might sound like an odd thing to say, but the reality is we all know that any relationship that is worthwhile and good and healthy, it takes work, doesn't it? It takes some intentionality. It takes purposefulness. It takes working at it to understand the other person. And that's essentially what Jesus is saying. Jesus says, I teach like this because if I made it so simple that everyone could understand it just like that, then they wouldn't have to put any effort in at all. Now, the disciples are like, okay, but Jesus, we don't even understand this. And he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll tell you guys what this story means. Because ultimately, the disciples are the ones that Jesus is training and teaching to replace him when he goes back to heaven. So he says, I'll tell you what it means. And as Jesus begins to explain the story, as he begins to describe what this story that teaches a point actually means, it becomes clear that Jesus isn't talking about a farmer, he's not talking about seeds, and he isn't talking about soil at all. He's talking about people. He's talking about 4 different categories of people. So as we jump back into Jesus' explanation, he still isn't exceptionally clear about all the nuts and bolts behind the scenes. So in the story, what I want you to understand as we go into the explanation is that the farmer is, in this case, Jesus, but someone who's teaching God's truth. It's somebody who's teaching God's truth. The seed in the story is God's truth. It's the message, it's the good news of Jesus. It's the gospel. And the locations, the soils, are people. So let's look at how Jesus explains this parable. Pick up in verse 18. Jesus says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. All right, so there's our first location. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and doesn't understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the path. The second location. Jesus says the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. There's our second location. The third location, Jesus says, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. It's the third location. And now our fourth. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what is sown. Now, as Jesus explains it, I think it's fairly easy to understand. But as was the case with Jesus, there's more happening under the hood. There's more depth, there's more significance than you see in a cursory listen or a cursory read of this. And so what we're going to do to really draw this out is we're going to take a look back and we're going to compile the descriptions that Jesus gives in the parable itself and then also in the explanation of the parable. So we're going to look at what Jesus says about the path in the parable and the path in the explanation. The rocky soil and the rocky soil, the thorns, and the good soil and the good soil. And we're going to compile those and look at how we're going to compare and contrast. We're going to look at how the different things, how they differ from one another, how they're similar. And crucially, what you're going to see in this is that there's a distinct progression that Jesus is identifying. That should be easy. For those of us that have walked with Jesus for a long time, it'll be easy to identify people who we've known that have been at every one of these stages. As we do this, we're going to look at 4 different kind of characteristics. In each thing, Jesus describes how the person hears the word. That's of crucial importance. How the person hears. Then we're going to look at the soil. How does Jesus describe the soil? We're going to look at how the seed grows in that soil. And then we're going to look at once it's done, what was the result of its life? And I think as we do this, you're going to see just how deep, how true, and how significant this teaching is in a way that you may not notice right off the bat. So let's look at the path first. In the parable, Jesus says, as he was scattering the seed, Dave, I did not warn Dave for this, so you can try to jump along with me or just leave it. Either way, it doesn't matter. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. And then in the explanation, he says, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. So in the parable, he says birds snatch the seed. In the explanation, he says the evil one comes and snatches away the word. So how does this person hear? Jesus says they hear, but they don't understand. They hear, but they don't understand. Now, under the hood, what's happening here is actually a little bit more significant than that. It's not just, well, I don't get it. What's happening here is a differentiation between our understanding and God's understanding. What's happening here is that all throughout the Bible, there's this significant emphasis placed on not just trying to understand God through our own wisdom, our own knowledge, our own ability, but trusting him in what we don't understand. And so as Jesus says, this is the person who doesn't understand. They hear, but they don't understand. I think that what Jesus is getting at is this is a person who is more interested in their own understanding than having faith and trust in God. Does that make sense? So they don't understand what God is saying because they aren't that interested in it. They're interested in things making sense to them. And if something God says is different than what makes sense to them, they're like, why? Then I don't believe what God says. Does that make sense? So how do they hear? They hear, but they don't understand it. What's the soil like? Jesus says this is the path. How many do I have anybody in here that's done any garden? Not like I have like a couple plants, but like that's done any gardening? Anybody? Okay. So what happens, for those of you gardeners, what happens when you've got pretty good soil and then you walk over that soil repeatedly? What is it? It compacts. So the soil eventually gets very, very hard and very firm, even if it was good to start with, because the weight of our body walking over it will compact the soil and it turns into bad soil. Now, in my garden that I've got at my mom's house, if I was to go out into my garden right now and I was to broadcast sow some seeds, I've got some areas with really good soil, and then I've got some paths. In the areas with good soil, most of the seed would go down into the soil because there's space for the seed to go down into the soil. But on the paths, it would just sit on the path. And then what would happen? Birds would come and eat it. That's not just like Jesus isn't just making that up, like that's what would happen. Maybe not today, but within the next 24 hours, every bit of that seed would be gone. Because it couldn't get down into the soil, and when the seed sits on top of the soil, birds see it and they come and eat it. Because birds like seeds. So the soil is compacted. It's hard. Jesus doesn't say that, but by nature of Jesus saying this is seed sown along the path, he's trusting that these people who live in an agricultural community, they would know seed sown along a path, it ain't going to grow, it's going to get eaten by birds. This would have made perfect sense to them. The soil is compacted and it's hard. So this is somebody who hears but doesn't understand, or maybe more accurately is more interested in their own understanding. Jesus compares this person to soil that is compacted and hard. So what's their growth like? Well, they never have a chance to grow because birds come and eat it before it ever even has a chance to take root. So the message, the gospel, the good news of Jesus, it's sown, but it can't grow. Nothing happens. And so what happens at the end of the plant's life? Well, at the end of the plant's life, it doesn't have a life. It dies before it ever could be alive. So this is the first type of person. This is the type of person who has no interest in God at all. Has no interest in faith, has no interest in anything that's outside of their own understanding. And Jesus says they kind of don't have any hope. Because before the good news of me ever even has a chance to root, it's going to get taken away. First type of person. The second type of soil, the rocky soil. In the parable, Jesus says, some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. And then in the description, or the explanation, Jesus says the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Rocky soil. How does the person, the rocky soil person, how do they hear? Jesus says, well, they hear and they receive with joy. They receive it at once with joy. It's interesting to note that this is the only place in the parable or in the explanation that Jesus mentions any sort of emotion, any sort of feeling. And I think that's significant. It says these are people who hear and they receive quickly with joy. So these are people who very, very quickly have a strong emotional response to the word. How does Jesus describe the soil? Jesus says there is soil, unlike on the path where there's really no soil, it's a path. In the rocky places there is soil, but it's shallow. It's minimal soil. As a result, the plant starts to grow. It starts to grow. But then what happens? Well, as we look at the growth of it that Jesus describes, he says it grows quickly at first. But because there's no roots to take up nutrients, to take up water from the ground, as soon as the sun comes out and starts to really scorch, that plant dies. So it grows. It's different than the plant on the path, than the seed on the path. It starts to grow, but it springs up very quickly, but it's shallow. And then what happens at the end of its life? Jesus says that it dies quickly when trouble and persecution come. And so what's the type of person that this is describing? I think that this is describing the kind of person whose faith is very emotional. It tends to be the people who get the most excited the fastest who also fizzle out the fastest, right? There have been a handful of people throughout the history of our church who they'll show up and like the very first Sunday, they're like, this is the greatest thing I've ever been a part of. I want to join a team and get into a small group and give. And I want to come back next week and do all of it right now. And you know what's funny that I've learned along the way? Those are also the people who at a certain point in time just vanish out of nowhere. They're like super excited real fast, and then when they're over it like now. I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. This is the person who, they get super excited, but it's an emotional level excitedness that leads to very shallow soil. And because there's no roots, then when things get difficult, they're just like, I'm out, I can't do this anymore. This doesn't make me happy anymore. I'm done. It costs me something. I'm done. Jesus felt good at first, but now following Jesus is hard, and I didn't sign up for hard. That's the rocky soil. The thorny soil. In the parable, Jesus said, other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. In the explanation, Jesus said, the seed falling among thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. As Chris and I were preparing this message this week, I've read this I don't even know how many times I've read this parable in my life. A lot. But when we took the descriptions and put them together, and when I really started to dig into this one, I was blown away at what I started to see. And here's why. I would estimate that 80 to 90% of the Christians that I've known in my whole life are this soil. At least, maybe more. This soil is the most common soil that exists inside Christian churches by a mile. There aren't a whole lot of path soils inside Christian churches. They aren't here. They're like, I don't care, I don't want anything to do with it. There's definitely rocky soil in some churches. This one, and there's good soil, which we'll get to in a moment. This one is massive. The thorny soil. How do they hear? Well, they hear and they grow. You don't see that baked into it. What Jesus actually says is the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word. Or I'm sorry, I was reading the good soil. Shouldn't do that. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, and that he immediately goes into, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. For as many times in my life as I've read this or heard it preached on, I never realized what Jesus was actually getting at here. When I hear it chokes the word, I always thought like, well, the plant withers and dies because it gets choked. But that's not what Jesus says. That's not what he says at all. Jesus says that the person hears and they do grow. They hear and they do grow. He says nothing about this person, this type of plant dying, or the plant in this soil dying. He says nothing about it. He says they hear and they grow. But the soil, what kind of soil is it? The soil is full of strong weeds. Now, thorny plants tend to be the most obnoxious. If you've ever had any kind of a garden, a flower bed, anything, you know, it's like the ones that are easy to pull are always the ones that don't hurt to pull. It's the thorny ones that are the hardest, right? For some reason, they're just strong. There's soil. It's not compacted soil. It's not shallow soil. It's soil with the depth to sustain the thorny weeds and the plant. So this is actually probably pretty good soil. But how does the plant grow in this soil? It grows, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it, leading, Jesus says, to unfruitfulness. So how does the plant die? it dies without ever having produced a crop. Now, I have a moderately sized garden. I've got about an 18 by 25 foot garden and a couple raised beds. I don't plant cucumber seed to look at a cucumber plant. I plant cucumber seed so that I can eat a cucumber. As the whole purpose is to get the fruit of the plant. I don't grow it to look at, now some of you might like flowers, like, well, I grow flowers. That's fine. Flowers don't fruit. This is about fruiting plants, plants that produce a crop. Jesus says that the thorny soil, there's soil there. It's good soil. It's good enough soil to sustain several different things. But what happens when the seed falls there is as it grows, there's stuff around it that prevents it from taking the nutrition needed to produce the whole point of the plant. And so it grows, and it's alive, but it's not even able to do what it's supposed to do. And why does Jesus say this happens? He says it happens because the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it. It's amazing to me how many times I've read this and never connected it. In all my years working with people, in all my years pastoring, in all my years doing this stuff, that's the thing that crushes most people's lives. The number of Christians that I've known in my life who believe in God and who, like, there's spiritual life in them, but they're so worried about everything around them, and or they're so focused on pursuing stuff that they're alive, but there's no fruit. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, I came that people would have life and have it abundantly, have it fully. In other words, it's this image of like thriving. Most Christians I know are not thriving. Most Christians I know are barely surviving. And when I strip it all down and I think about when I've heard people's stories, what are the things they say? It's worries of life and deceitfulness of wealth. That's the stuff that gets people hung up. That's the stuff that keeps people stuck. Because when I'm so focused on all the stuff around me that worries me, on all the things that I'm concerned about, on all the things that are wrong, on all I'm here and then 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 I'm here. Or if I like stuff and the deceitfulness of wealth, you guys know what the deceitfulness of wealth is, right? It's that there's never enough. No matter what thing, no matter what promotion, no matter what income, you want more, you want more, you want more, you want more. How many times in your life have you thought, man, if I just got that promotion at work and I could get to like that income threshold, things would be great. Well, what happens? You get to that income threshold and things aren't great. And then you want the next income threshold and the next one. And it's just this, and I've got to do this and I've got to do this so that I can advance, so that I can get that thing, so that I can keep up with the neighbors, so that I this, so that I that. And when we're focused on all that stuff, we forget to focus on the things that matter most. And we don't prioritize the very few things that actually feed our souls. The very few things that we need to be truly alive. And so we grow. There's a plant there. It grows. But at the end of it, it never thrived. There was not fruit. That's the thorny soil. And then Jesus finishes with the good soil. He says, still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop. What's the difference? What's the only type of soil that produces a crop? Is the good soil. 160 or 30 times what was sown. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30. So how does the good soil, how do they hear? They hear and they understand. Now remember all the way back, why does Jesus talk in parables? He says, because I want people to work at it a little bit. Here's the reality. One read through of the Bible, one read through of a Bible story, 5 years of reading through the Bible, 10 years of reading through the Bible, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of reading through the Bible, you won't understand it. And that might sound really overwhelming. That might sound really frustrating. But that's intentional. It is amazing to me how much I see in the Bible now that I didn't. I've been a Christian my whole life. I've been reading the Bible since I was young. I know the stories. I've known the parable of the sower I don't have a memory of not knowing this parable. And yet this week in reading and studying for this message, I saw things I've never seen before. After 30 some years of reading the Bible, I'm seeing things I've never seen. Is it because the Bible changed? No. It's because I've changed. And because in my childhood, I couldn't understand this. It's because now I've gotten into gardening. And so when I read a gardening metaphor, I understand it differently than I understood it before. It's not that truth has changed. I just see it differently because I'm different. And for the rest of my life, as God continues to work on me, as God continues to mold and shape my heart, I'll continue to see the Bible differently and differently and differently and differently as God shows me things that I couldn't have seen before. So this is someone who hears and who understands because they're working for it. Well, what kind of soil is this? Jesus isn't specific, but let me just go ahead and tell you. Good soil is loose, it's free of rocks, and it's free of weeds. Those things that are present in the other soil, they aren't present in good soil. What happens to the plant? It grows and it thrives. And crucially, when it dies having produced a huge multiplied crop. So when we look at these types of soils, one next to another, what's the difference? What is it that Jesus is clearly saying this is the goal? It's fruitfulness. It's fruit. In my garden right now, I've got potatoes, and I've got peppers, and I've got tomatoes, and I've got cucumber, and I've got corn, and I've got green beans. I've got broccoli. I just pulled out my snap peas. I've got onions. I've got a pretty decent amount of stuff. And I've got a whole bunch of it that's like right there. I've gotten one cucumber. Oh my God. If you've never had a garden fresh, it's like a different thing. What you get in the store is not a cucumber. I don't know what it is, but it is not a cucumber. One right off the vine is a totally different thing. I've got 2 cucumbers that are going to be ready today. The first one survived 7 minutes in my house. And that's not a joke. I brought it in and my family followed me around. I had a knife. Can I have another slice, another slice, another slice? I cannot wait. Because the whole point is to get the fruit. That's the whole point. Well, is the seed different from soil to soil? No. It's a farmer who's doing this. It's the same seed. Is the farmer different? No. So what's the difference? The difference is the quality of the soil. This parable, if I could reduce it all down to one important truth, it would be that our fruit, the fruit in our lives, is the result of our soil, not the seed. That's what Jesus is teaching. The fruit in our lives is the direct result. It's the direct result of our soil. It has nothing to do with the seed. The seed is good. But it's our soil that makes all the difference in the world. Now, here's the point of that. As we read a parable like this, I think that what Jesus intended when he was teaching in these parables was for us to use our imagination, to put ourselves in the midst of the parable, and to say, which one am I? Which one am I? Am I the path? Am I the rocky soil? Am I the thorny soil? Or am I the good soil? What is the evidence of that in my life? Is my life fruitful? Am I growing in the fruit of the Spirit in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control? Do I see those things growing in my life? And do I see how those things, as God grows them, are impacting the people around me? If so, I'm probably good soil. And that's great. But maybe I'm the path. Maybe if I don't understand it, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, that shows that my heart is compacted and it's hard. Maybe I'm the rocky soil. Maybe I'm a person who's very emotional in my faith. Maybe when things are good, then I'm like super on fire for Jesus, but when things are bad, I'm not even sure I believe in him. Maybe I'm the thorny soil. Maybe, and to be real honest, my suspicion is that this is most of us. Maybe I'm the type of person who I believe in God. I believe the message. There's growth there. There's something there. But to be real honest, there's no fruit. I just feel stuck. I'm like living but barely. I'm mostly just surviving. And there's just stuff all around me that I'm constantly focused on that takes me away from the things that matter most. I think the point of understanding that our fruit is the result of our soil and not the seed. The point is to say, which soil am I? Because here's the reality. If we're going to fix this in our lives, Jesus says there is good soil. And I don't know boatloads about soil, but I know enough to know that you can fix bad soil. You can. And so if in our lives we're going to get to where we are fruitful, where we are not just growing, not just alive, but we're thriving in our life and in our faith, it requires us to, number one, test our soil. We have to know what it is. When I took over the garden where I garden, it's at my mom's house, and my dad gardened forever. And when my dad passed away a couple of years ago, I knew that was something that I wanted to keep going. I didn't want that part of him to die. And so last year was the first year that I really took the garden on, and I grew a few things, but it wasn't super fruitful because the soil was not good. If you garden, you know that in this area we've got super heavy clay soil. And that is not conducive to plants growing very well if you don't do the second thing, which is amend the soil. You got to test it. You got to know what kind of soil you are. Are you the path? Are you the rocky ground? Are you the thorny ground? Are you the good ground? Which soil are you? Which soil, God, which soil am I? Am I somebody who my faith is too dependent on my emotions? Or am I somebody who the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth are choking out my life? Like I'm alive, but there's not much there. God, which one am I? You got to test your soil. Once you know what it is, then you can go about amending it. At the beginning of the season, I bought what was supposed to be 3 yards of compost. But as my friend Matt, who helped me load it, it was more than 3 yards of compost. It was a lot. And I tilled in a huge amount of compost like the first 6 inches of my garden. You know what's amazing? The soil's so much better. There's structure to it. And it can breathe. And my plants, they look awesome this year. They look totally different than they did last year. Because my soil's better. I didn't do anything different. I just amended this. I made the soil better. And when the soil gets better, so do the plants. But you got to know how to amend it. You got to know which one it is. If you're somebody who if you're the path, oh man, you need to take a tiller to that bitterness and anger that's inside you. You got to bust that stuff up. Whatever things have happened in your life that have caused you to be angry with people, angry with God, that have caused your heart to get hard and bitter, you've got to break that stuff up or it will destroy you because the word can't make its way in. If you're somebody who identifies more as the rocky soil, you've got to make that soil deeper. Because if it's only on your emotion, at some point, it's going to just burn out because you don't have the roots to sustain it when life gets hard. If you're somebody who identifies more as the thorny soil, you got to get those weeds out of there. You got to quit focusing on all the weeds and all the worries and all the stuff, and you've got to get back to what matters most. You got to test your soil, and then you've got to amend your soil. And then the last thing, if you're ever going to make this work, is you've got to repeat it. My soil this year in my garden is good. But next year, it won't be quite as good. The year after that, it won't be quite as good. And at some point, that soil is going to go back to just being hard, dense, heavy clay soil. Unless I am constantly looking and testing and saying, what do I need to do to make this better? What do I need to do to make it more healthy? What do I need to do to create the recipe for growth? Do I need compost this year? Do I need to add some sand to break up the clay? What do I need to do? Following Jesus, having healthy soil in your life is not well, I did one thing one time and now I'm good. It is a lifelong process of testing what's inside and asking what kind of soil is in me and what do I need to do to amend it to make it healthy so that the Word of God can grow inside of me. So I don't know where you land in that. I don't know what kind of soil is in your heart. I don't know if you feel like you're the path, if you feel like you're the rocky ground, if you feel like you're the thorny ground. What I know is that when we do this right, that the soil inside of us can become rich, life-giving, full of all the things necessary for our lives to be full of really great fruit. And I know that because I've watched it in other people's lives. I know that because it's happened in my life. And I know that because I know that God is faithful. Now, what's going to happen in a moment is I'm going to pray for us. And as I do, the band is going to come up, and we're going to do a closing song today. And it's a song that's really, really repetitive. The lyrics in the verse say, "Here is where I lay it down. Every burden, every crown, this is my surrender." The chorus says, "I will make room for you to do whatever you want to." The bridge says, "Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better." That's kind of what good soil looks like. It looks like saying, I'm going to lay all my stuff down. I'm going to surrender all my stuff to make room for you to do whatever you want in my life. Because your way is better. And so as we sing here in a moment, here's what I want to ask you to do. It's easy to sing, to just stand and kind of like parrot the words. But the reality is, for every one of us, if we want better soil in our lives, the words in the song that we're going to sing are words that shouldn't just be words that we're kind of parroting back, but they should be our prayer. God, I'm giving you all of me. I am creating room for you to do what you need. Not in my understanding, but in yours. Because your way is better. And so as we sing, I would just ask, if you want to sit, you can sit. If you want to stand, you can stand. If you want to kneel, you can kneel. You can do whatever you want. I don't care at all. But I want you to use this time not as just I'm going to sing along because that's what you do in a church worship service. But I want to ask you to take this moment to offer yourself to God. To surrender yourself to Him. And to tell Him why. Because His way is better. And so if you're the path, if you're the rocky ground, if you're the thorny ground, I want you to take this moment to cultivate some better soil in your heart. And to ask God to do whatever He needs inside of you in these few moments. And as we sing, do that however you need to. If you want to come pray, you can come. We don't have altars, and whatever. If you want to come pray, you can come pray. I'll be down here. I'll pray for you. I don't care. I don't know what it looks like for you, but I know that for some of us, we need some better soil in our lives. And when we're done with that song, I'm going to come up. I'm going to speak a benediction over us. We're going to go. And if you want to stick around, if you want to pray, if you want to just spend some time with God cultivating some soil, you do that. Let me pray for us.